Today I'm going to talk about research integrity in the age of AI. I will give you a kind of a snapshot on what research integrity means at the moment when we're talking about generative AI. What I will not do is give you some kind of prescriptive position by the Ombuds Committee of Research Integrity in Germany, which is the organization that I work for. But it's more a snapshot of what you can find in the multiple policies that exist on the topic of AI and research integrity. That means policies from publishers, from universities, and from other related organizations. Because as you're going to see, while there are a lot of policies already at the moment, the policy landscape is somewhat heterogeneous, and that can make it quite difficult for researchers to navigate that topic. And what makes this even more complicated is also that we as researchers, I mean, I'm a researcher myself, though from a different field, have very conflicting views on AI and AI use as well. And there's this wonderful study that was done by Nature very recently, and I want to share two slides from that study. In that survey, respondents were asked to rate a number of scenarios. And you find a scenario here on the left side of the slide. And they were confronted with a question that says, Dr. Blocks writes a first draft of their research article, then they use ChatGPT or another Gen AI tool to help edit the article, such as by asking for suggestions about its clarity, flow, or tone. And they don't disclose that they used AI. And the respondents were asked, what is your view of this behavior? And what we can see here are two things which are interesting, I'd say. The first thing is that we can see that based on the status group, the younger the status group, the more likely they are to find that behavior appropriate. That's maybe not too surprising. We kind of know that the younger cohorts tend to be more open when it comes to AI. But more interestingly, from a research integrity perspective, is that the majority in each group, in each status group, said this behavior is only appropriate if Dr. Blocks discloses that they used AI. And a significant chunk of each group even saying that it's only appropriate if Dr. Blocks discloses details of the prompts that they used. Why this is so interesting, that's something we're going to focus on later when we actually look into the policies, but also what makes this really interesting is when we read it in conjunction with another question from the same survey. And that question was, have you done this yourself? I.e., you wrote a draft and then you used a Gen AI tool to edit the language of said draft. And here again, you can see the younger the cohort, the more likely it is that they have done so. But also, again, more interestingly, the majority in each group, apart from the retired, where it's a tie, said, yes, I have done so, but without disclosing that I used AI. So we have the paradox, if you want to call it that way, is that the same respondents say, if other people do it, I want them to disclose AI, but they are unwilling, or at least they didn't disclose AI when they did it themselves. Now, why people are not disclosing AI when they use it is a whole separate question that I will not really go into. If you want, we can discuss that later. But you see that this is one issue already that we're facing when we're talking about research integrity. It's like how people use AI themselves and want to use it, and how they see the behavior and the usage of AI by other researchers. And with that in mind, let's look at the state of research integrity in the age of AI. Here's a quick summary of Gen AI and research integrity. So when we look at studies that look at the usage of AI by researchers and students, we can see that the majority of researchers by now make use of AI. And this figure is rising. And when we look at students, this figure is already very high. So you see we have approximately like 90% in international studies, even more than 90% of students saying they use AI or regularly use AI for university coursework. And we also have by now a wide range of guidelines on the use of AI in research and teaching. But as I already mentioned, the policy landscape is characterized by heterogeneity, but there's a certain minimum consensus, and I will tell you what that minimum consensus is. But on the other hand, there are also significant gaps still when we look into the policies, and we will also look at those gaps. And when we look at a certain trend, even though we're talking about 3 years here, we see that guidelines initially were very prohibitive in nature, saying the use of AI is generally not permitted. That was the case of most guidelines in the very beginning. By now, we see that most guidelines, especially for research, I'm not talking about guidelines for students here, I'm talking about guidelines for researchers. These guidelines by now tend to say the use of AI is permitted, that permission is subject to certain conditions very often, but it is important what kind of usage types we're talking about when it comes to what is permitted and how you're supposed to disclose it. And it's these details that we're going to look at now in the next few slides. There are, as I said, there are many guidelines. This is a slide for you to give you an idea what the key texts, especially in the beginning, were and are that really triggered the development of certain guidelines or that triggered the development of certain positions on the usage of AI. So, for example, very important, that's the penultimate point here, the co-position statement from 2023 already that wrote on authorship and AI tools. And we're going to see that on a later slide. They basically said AI tools cannot be listed as authors, and this has become the standard that you find in every guidelines. So there are some key texts that very early on very often means 2023, have set down certain positions and rules that are still being followed by most of the guidelines nowadays. And to give you an idea, I mentioned this minimum consensus in most guidelines. I crafted this overview here on the guidelines by the big publishers, because you as researchers, I mean, usually what matters to you is on the one hand your university's guideline, but mostly also the guideline, the AI policy of the publisher where you want to publish your research. And so what you can see, what all of these have in common is that they say AI cannot be an author. That's something that's said, and from the perspective of research integrity, this is probably not going to change anytime soon. What a lot of these guidelines also say is that if you use AI, you need to specifically declare that usage. Now, you can see here that this is something you can find in all the guidelines. It seems to be a consensus, but this becomes a bit more tricky when we actually look into the details. And I did bring some guidelines as examples for you to see how different these guidelines phrase this and how much information you as an author, as a researcher are given. And this can kind of vary widely. What you can also see from this overview is that there's, for now, absolutely no consensus when it comes to AI-generated images. So a lot of the consensus exists on using generative AI for text generation or for working on text. But when it comes to images, there is no consensus at all at the moment. And you can see that the spectrum ranges from policy saying it's not allowed at all to use AI for generating images to some policies saying it is allowed, but with some restrictions. And what that means, we're going to look at later. Also on the issue of AI and peer review, you see that there is not a clear consensus. Most policies agree that AI should not play a central role in peer review. Some policies say it is not allowed at all, and some policies say that use is only allowed in a restricted way. What it exactly means, we're going to look at later on in this presentation. So let me cycle through all of these 4 topics to explain a little bit more what all of these mean for you also as researchers. The most simple one is AI and authorship. I mentioned it. This is the co-position, by the way, which you see here on the right. It's a very short position statement. This isn't a long paper. It's really just a very short position statement, but it carried a lot of weight for basically almost all policies. And the important thing about this is not so much, please don't list AI tools as authors, but for you to keep in mind that the responsibility for the use of AI and all of its contributions, meaning also any kind of violation of research integrity through the use of an AI, that responsibility lies with you, the human authors of a publication. So if you use generative AI, it makes some kind of mistakes, something dumb, this will kind of lie on your shoulders. And we will come back to that. You'll find some, or you did find some publications in the past that listed AI as authors, but a lot of these have been corrected by now. So you don't really find that in the literature anymore. There are very few exceptions. And there was a study in 2023 that showed that there is, in that study, there was like a quarter of researchers that said that they can imagine listing AI as an author. But again, this was very early, i.e. in 2023. By now, all the policies say AI cannot be an author. More interestingly, maybe, is the whole question of how to use AI in compliance with research integrity when it comes to the declaration. Generally, if the use of Gen AI is permitted in a policy, it must generally be declared. But there are exceptions by now. This is a kind of trend that we're seeing, that some policies say that if you only use Gen AI as an aid for linguistic post-processing, i.e. using AI for improving the flow of language or for improving orthography, grammar, punctuation, etc., then you don't need to declare the use of AI. But you need to be really aware of the differences in policies. Some policies have that exceptions. Some of the policies do not have that exception. What's also problematic from the point of view of researchers is that the exact form of the declaration has not yet been standardized. So it really depends on the policy, how that declaration has to look like. And sometimes policies don't even give you any details how that declaration has to look like. So all of that, again, rests on you to find out what does the individual publisher want from me, how does the declaration has to look, and sometimes it's you have to find like extra information. How can you declare AI so that it seems to be sufficient to the publisher? And of course, one of the reasons why the publishing regulations are sometimes so very vague is because these publishers are really big and have to be applicable across disciplines, and that kind of conflicts with discipline-specific reading expectations, method, manuscript structure, replicability, etc. So again, we come from very different fields. What's kind of good practice in your field, or how you kind of structure a paper, is very different from how this is done in my field, whether it's my original field or the one that I work in now. What makes this even more difficult, and I'm sorry that I have to kind of say this even more difficult, is that many publishing policies have already been revised once since the introduction of generative AI, and publishing policies don't always have dates. So again, there might be the case that you look up a publishing policy at the beginning of a project, and then you look at the publishing policy again once you finish the manuscript, and it might have changed in the meantime. This is a case that can absolutely happen. Fortunately, so to speak, usually policies get more lax over time. So what we've been witnessing is that usually they've become more lax in the form of that less usage cases need to be declared. So for example, there's linguistic post-processing. And of course, not only guidelines are constantly evolving, but the technology is also constantly evolving. You probably know that what we're seeing now with agentic AI and these so-called deep research modes that can do other things or do things differently than generative AI of the past. 3 years. And this might also mean that guidelines will have to be adapted. And that, of course, makes everything a bit more troublesome. I want to show you, oh, I don't know what's this Beispiel, that wasn't translated. I want to show you two policies to give you an idea how these policies look like, but also how they can differ. This is a policy from Wiley. Wiley, in my opinion, has quite a good AI policy. You have to note that Wiley has two AI policies, one for book authors, one for journal authors. Very important to find the right one which applies to you. And the policies give you, both policies give you a lot of details, what kind of usage you need to declare, and also what you see here, how you need to declare it, like what kind of items need to be in that declaration. The location of the AI supported content, the AI tools, the purpose of the AI tool, and what Wiley wants you to do is also to give some kind of reflection on the AI use. These are the two last points here in the suggestion for the AI declaration. And they even give you an example declaration that you can follow. The downside, so to speak, of the AI policy by Wiley is that it's a very long policy. Once you kind of follow that link, you will see that it's like roughly 20 pages long. So again, that demands a lot of upfront labor of you to kind of read that AI policy in depth to see what applies to you and what does not apply to you. The a contrary example is this AI policy here by Springer Nature. And I highlighted this part for you. So it kind of says in the beginning, as I said, AI cannot be an author. And then it talks about that declaration. And it says use of an LLM should be properly documented in the method section, or if that's not available, in a suitable alternative part of the manuscript. That's all that you get here from Springer Nature. Then they also say, by the way, copy editing does not need to be declared. This is, again, one of the policies where you find that exception, but you don't get any information what they mean by properly documented. So this is a bit up to you, what you think qualifies as properly documented. And these two examples give you a good idea how broad and how kind of different these AI policies may look like. And again, this is a screenshot here from the Springer Nature AI policy, but the AI policy is not much longer than this screenshot. And compare that to the Wiley policy, which is about like 20 pages long. So that's what I also meant with the heterogeneity of the policies. As I already mentioned, we also find a lot of heterogeneity when it comes to other usage cases of AI. And one that is particularly contentious is the use of AI for generating images. And you've probably by now have seen a lot of this kind of AI slop also in research manuscripts and in research publications. And this might be one of the reasons why publishers are a lot more careful when it comes to allowing AI-generated images. Another reason is that they're afraid of the violation of intellectual property rights when it comes to images. So when you look into the guidelines of various publishers, you see that some do not allow any AI-generated images under any circumstances. And AI-generated images include something like flowcharts, for example. So we're not only talking about photographs or research data images, but like really any kind of figure or image. Some, like Nature, only allow AI-generated images in articles or journals that deal with AI. So only what like specifically topically fits. Again, Wiley is very specific in its AI policy, and they actually give you a table that shows what kind of images. So, for example, flowcharts are permitted for Wiley publications, while, of course, images that pretend to be research data are not permitted. And they are not permitted, by the way, or should not be permitted by any publishers. What can be said for all of these publishing guidelines is that if AI-generated images are permitted, then just as with text, the use of AI must be declared. What's problematic is that we have, to my knowledge, no guidelines so far for any other kind of formats or research outputs. So, for example, if you look at posters at conferences or presentations, we don't really have, well, to my knowledge, any guidelines that detail how you should be dealing or declaring AI use for these other formats. So again, we see that a lot, or I see that a lot in presentations by now, but also here we have no clear rules for disclosure. So that's definitely something that you should be discussing internally in your research groups or with your supervisors, because we don't really have any standardized guidelines for these cases. When it comes to peer review, as I also said, there is not a clear consensus on the use of AI, but there is some consensus that says that the use of AI in peer review is at least limited, if not completely forbidden. So we have some publishers limiting the use of AI in peer review or not permitting it at all. And what's really new, that was a really recent thing, is the new guideline by the DFG on artificial intelligence in the review process. You kind of see that here on the right. And the DFG kind of made a step forward, you can say, or you can also say a step backwards, depending on your position, on AI. And they allowed some use of AI for peer review or for the review process in grant applications. And in the guideline, I'll have that on the next slide. They actually detail what you're allowed to use AI for in the review process and what you're not allowed to use AI for. When you look at researchers' perspectives and publications on this topic, you see that researchers tend to see the use of AI in peer review very critically. So there are some publications that are listed here where most of the researchers speak against any kind of use of AI in peer review. And when the DFG first announced the new guideline on AI in the review process, they did that in December or January. And it only came out now in April. There was even the hashtag defund DFG in the social networks by some researchers who were very unhappy with that decision of the DFG to allow for the use of some AI in the review process. Nevertheless, what we can also see in some studies is that researchers are actually using AI for peer review, despite the fact that a lot of publishers do not allow AI in peer review. So here we have again another discrepancy, which also points to a problem that I will look at in a few minutes, namely the topic of detection. But first, let's have a quick look at the guideline of the DFG. You can find it published also on Zenodo. And it defines AI as a supporting tool, not a substitute for human judgment. So they kind of say the nucleus or the most important part of the review still has to be done by a human, but they can use AI as a support tool. And here it specifies AI may be used for textual and structural support, literature searches, and formal text checks, while the academic analysis, evaluation, and recommendation remain the exclusive responsibility of the individual reviewer. And this is kind of something that we're seeing that's a new kind of step when it comes to what AI or what researchers are allowed to do with AI, especially in the review process. I just mentioned it, that this is a topic that is very problematic, despite the fact that it's very omnipresent, and that is detection. How can we actually tell if something has AI elements in it or that was created with the help of AI? And they are certain tools, detection tools, and you probably have heard or read about some of them. There's this kind of cycle, and there's always a new tool coming up and being lauded. At the moment, it's Pangram that you can read about very often. The problem is that we have some studies that show that these software tools are not sufficiently reliable to really tell what's AI generated and what's human generated. And studies, that's this Gauss study, also showed that we as humans are not necessarily better in telling what's AI generated and what's human generated. And of course, it becomes much more difficult if AI was used at some point in the process, but then kind of reworked multiple times by humans in the loop. And that's, of course, a problem when we talk about research integrity, but also when we speak about guidelines that demand declaration, but that cannot reliably detect any AI generated content. How are we going to enforce these guidelines if we cannot detect AI? That's a problem for publishers, but of course, this whole aspect of detection of AI or the impossibility of reliably detecting AI is also a problem for us researchers. And I'll come to that in a minute, but I just want to explain that screenshot here on the right. This comes from a website by the name of Academe AI, and this was done by one researcher who collected journal articles, but also conference posters that have clear marks of AI usage. And clear marks here means these typical phrases that LLMs offer to you when you kind of chat with them, something like, certainly here's an introduction for you, or as a large language model, I cannot do whatever. And he identified papers that still have these phrases in them, but do not disclose that AI was used and are also published in the literature. And as you can see, the last time I looked at that website and made the screenshot, he had identified more than 800 examples in the literature that still had these clear phrases in it and were not retracted yet. The problem with detection does not only concern text, but it also concerns images. And I have two examples here for you to show the problem of whether it's not possible to detect AI-generated images or material. So what you can see here on the left, this was actually done by a person who was into research integrity, and they created this image where the first rows, this here, if you can see my cursors, these are what he writes, supposedly real tumor samples, and the final row was AI generated, something you probably are not able by just looking at the picture. Similarly, if you look at these pictures here on the right, this comes from a study where these images were created to show what AI can do when it comes to the creation of realistic looking research data images. And to help you read this, the two images that have a green frame, these are real images. All of the images with a red frame, these are generated with the help of AI. And again, this isn't my field, but I'm very positive that just by looking at them, you would be hard pressed to say which of these are AI generated and which one of these are real images. And to make matters worse, this study where these images came from was published already in 2022. So that was before all of the models that people are using right now were actually developed or open to the public, let's put it this way. And that's something that we kind of increasingly see. This comes from another study that talks about the danger of deepfakes, especially when it comes to images from medicine. While you're listening to me, you can guess if you want which of these images are AI generated and which of these images are real images. And again, this is another study, very recent, that talks about exactly this kind of danger also for other researchers and of course also for practitioners reading the literature, that it will be increasingly hard to be able to tell which images are real and which images are fake, and thereby able to tell which research is real and what kind of research is fake. And that brings us increasingly, of course, also to the risks when it comes to generative AI. What we are seeing is, as this paper calls it, an explosion of formulaic research articles, for example, that make use of at least real data from open databases, for example, the US National Health Database, and that turn that data into kind of fake papers, which they kind of churn out with great speed. And when I say they, we're talking about an industry here that is commonly called paper mills, called that way because they're kind of churning out papers that do not follow any kind of criteria of good research practice and very often are fabricated or falsified, both when it comes to the data and to the articles themselves, depending on kind of who created them. And you will increasingly find these fake papers by paper mills in the literature. This is a growing problem that we're kind of witnessing or monitoring in the field of research integrity. And the problem is because this is some kind of shadow industry, it's very hard to say how big the problem is at the moment. But there are certain kind of research or different kind of research approaches to find out how big that problem is of these kind of fake publications. And we have numbers that say that up to 20% of all the literature in the biomedical fields that was published in the recent years came from so-called paper mills. So that's a huge amount of papers that you will also kind of come across in your lifetime as researchers that might be fake. And that's something just to look out for. And of course, this kind of development that we already saw pre-Gen AI is now being accelerated, incredibly accelerated by the easy accessibility of generative AI tools, all kinds of generative AI tools. And what we're also increasingly seeing are other risks and problems when it comes to generative AI. We see more and more so-called hallucinated citations, so papers using references that don't really exist or are wrong in a way that they don't really point to existing citations. And this kind of clogs the literature. And again, the process of correcting that or retracting these papers is very slow. And we also have increasingly more and more researchers who try to warn people of what Messer and Crockett here call the uncritical use of AI in science and all the kind of risks that come with that uncritical use. And to give you an overview, I tried to cluster the different kind of risks in three groups, so to speak. On the one hand, we have the illegitimate use of AI, and that's something that most likely you're not doing yourself, I hope. I'm pretty sure. But that's just something you need to be aware of because you will be on the receiving end of this illegitimate use because there will be a general increase in paper mill output. There will be more falsification, fabrication, a lack of transparency in general. And that's just something that you have to be aware of more and more while you do your research, while you read papers. There's also, of course, any kind of risks associated with the improper use of AI, any kind of use of AI without verification, using AI without the proper knowledge of how it works, but also all the kind of epistemic risks that come with the use of AI. All of this is something to keep in mind if or when you're using AI for your very own research. And of course, in a third group, I would list all the inherent risks when it comes to AI. You know that most tools are commercial, or most tools that also researchers are using are commercial. And yes, there are by now some tools that are open or more open. There are also tools that are compliant with data protection laws. There are tools that are locally hosted, etc. Maybe a research institution also offers access to these tools. That's good. However, whenever I talk to researchers, most of them make use of commercial tools. And if you do so, you're kind of buying all of these inherent risks kind of with the use of these commercial tools, including copyright and intellectual property rights violations, lack of transparency, the so-called black box phenomenon, and all the kind of problematic ethical aspects that are part of these commercial tools. So to end that presentation, I want to bring you three sample scenarios. scenarios coming from our own work, because the place where I work at, we not only do research on that topic, we also actually help people who have either questions or who have run into conflicts or problems when it comes to research integrity. And what we're, of course, seeing is an increasing amount of problems and conflicts stemming from the use or the improper use of AI in research. And I just want to present 3 sample scenarios and the consequences or what we can offer that person as recommendations. So this was a case that we had a couple of months ago where we were contacted by a PhD student who had written an article with 3 other people from his team. He had used an AI tool to write his part, but he hadn't told his co-authors, and he also did not disclose the use of AI in the publication, so the publisher also did not know. The manuscript was submitted and published. And after it was published, sometime after it was published, he wanted to make use of that paper to build a new paper on it, and then he realized that there were hallucinated references in that published article. And he called us to ask what he can do now, what's the kind of process, and what's going to happen to him. Well, the problem is that we can say, well, you now need to inform anyone involved, telling them what you did. We can't really say what is going to happen, because at the moment we lack basically a codified approach of how publishers, but also the research community reacts to hallucinated references. So there are some suggestions in the literature that we should treat hallucinated references as a kind of fabrication of data. If we do so, then that's research misconduct. So that's the kind of the highest form of research integrity violation. And that means that you're going to be sanctioned. It means that this paper will be retracted. And it might also mean that, for example, if this paper, which we don't know, is part of a dissertation, a cumulative dissertation, that this might have consequences for that PhD student in question. It might also have consequences actually for all of the authors in question, because all of the authors on a paper are responsible for the content of that paper, and that includes for any kind of AI-generated content. And again, you see the snatch here is that we can now debate, is it fair to these other authors because they didn't even know that there was any AI-generated content? And the problem is we're only just now having these discussions to try to codify these research integrity violations. And for the moment being, what will happen is that each publishing house and kind of each side is trying to find a way to solve that problem by themselves. You might have heard or read very recently, last week, that arXiv, that preprint server, has decided that if you have what they call AI slop in your preprint, and they include hallucinated references in that definition for AI slop, that means you will actually be barred from publishing with arXiv for at least a year. And afterwards, you're only allowed to publish with arXiv after you've been reviewed. So they're actually taking a strong stance here when it comes to these hallucinated references. And I expect, but of course I can't say this for sure, but I expect that other actors in the field, other publishers, but also guidelines will actually follow. And we're going to be quite tough on this instance, i.e. on hallucinated references in the literature. So that's something to really keep in mind. The second scenario might be something that you are going to run into, especially if you're a PhD student, and that is we had a PhD student calling us who used generative AI to improve the writing of her thesis and for translation work, and now she wanted to ensure that this use is A, permitted, and B, that it is correctly declared. And the problem is that her institution had no guidelines for the use of AI for doctoral students, and her supervisor also was unsure about the matter. So now she was like really unsure if it was actually permitted and if it would influence her PhD thesis in any way. Again, what we can do in that matter is to point her to the existing landscape of guidelines to tell her what's out there, and that mostly the use of AI for something like language processing is permitted and usually doesn't even need to be declared. For translation, by the way, there's a lot more heterogeneity. Some guidelines say that translation needs to be declared. Some guidelines say it does not need to be declared. What we told that student is, or the PhD student is, that it's most likely permitted in her case, that she should discuss it with her supervisor, and that it's safest for her if she declares it, because at the moment it's best to err on the side of transparency. The third problem, or the third scenario that we're kind of increasingly seeing, are the problems of dissenting views of Gen AI in authorship teams. So imagine a project team collecting and evaluating data together for joint publication, and then the team discusses whether they want to use AI to help them write the manuscript. And you have two authors who would like to use generative AI tool, while two authors are against the use of Gen AI tools. And that is a big problem. Because, well, you need to agree as a team of authors when you work together. And if that actually leads to some authors secretly using AI, this can quickly morph into the first sample scenario that I brought. That you're going to have problems with your manuscript later, and people just didn't know that there was AI use in it. So therefore, a recommendation I want to give PhD students, but basically any researcher nowadays, is that when you start a research project, when you start the work on a manuscript, please discuss with your co-authors how you feel about using generative AI in your work, for what kind of usage it's allowed, depending on your policy or the policy of the publisher where you want to publish, but also what kind of use all of the authors feel comfortable with, and talk about a way how to document that internally so that each author is in the know what other authors, co-authors are doing, because that also helps you to then verify and check, or maybe double check, the output that was kind of created with the help of AI. And this will then, I think, hopefully help to prevent any problems that might arise with the kind of secret use of AI or non-verified use of AI. These are kind of three sample scenarios when it comes to using AI in research nowadays, and how I view them from the perspective of research integrity. If you have more questions, we now have time to discuss your questions, but also if you want to kind of read about this, again, I have created an FAQ on research integrity and artificial intelligence. It's available in German and in English. And I also have a reading list with lots of literature, but also with a lot of policies by publishing houses and others on research integrity and AI. And you find both on our website.